Welcome to this webinar on the 2014 case study for the P2 audit practice paper. This is essentially a feedback session, and it's for the benefit of candidates taking the Professional 2 Audit Practice and Assurance Services paper at the August 2014 session. My name is Gerard Long, and I'm the examiner for Audit Practice and Assurance Services at PE2. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to look back over the question 1 of the April 2014 paper, and this was a question called the Irish View. Now, question 1 in the AAS exam will always be a case study, and it will always be for 50 marks. Now, as you're aware, the duration of the paper, apart from reading time, is 210 minutes. That's 3.5 hours. So therefore, as a candidate for this exam, you will have a maximum of 105 minutes, or an hour and 45 minutes, to complete the question. That doesn't include your reading time, and please use your reading time carefully. Now, the particular case study that we're looking at now, the Irish View, was comparatively short. And one of the things to notice about it was that it actually did not contain summary financial statements. Most of, or well, not most necessarily, but a lot of the case studies on this paper will contain some form of summary financial statement. So they will contain either a statement of financial position, an income statement, or something like a cash flow statement. This particular one didn't happen too. So it was perhaps a little bit shorter than the average. However, you should be aware of the fact that you might well get a case study with that kind of information in it, with an income statement or with a statement of financial position. If you do get that kind of information, that is, you can use your 20 minutes of reading time to examine and to look at that information. On balance, the question, the Irish View, was actually well answered in the exam. In fact, nearly all of the candidates who passed the examination did so by passing the case study and performing at least adequately on the remainder of the paper. Now, I mightn't be able to recall every single script to mind, but I can't recall to mind a single script where a candidate who failed to achieve a pass mark on the case study actually passed the examination overall. Candidates' performance on the case study was absolutely vital for the overall examination. And very, very few candidates, it was a particular feature of the April 2014 paper, that very few candidates performed better on Section B than they did on Section A. Most people performed better on Section A, and most people who passed the exam passed it because of their performance on Section A. Now, as is normally the case, there were a number of parts. There will always be a number of parts to the case study question. There might be 5, there might be 6, there might even be 7 parts. Okay. Now, on this occasion, there were 5 parts to the question. And another feature was that the marks for each of those parts were relatively evenly spread. There weren't very big differences. So we didn't have, as we have had on some previous occasions, we haven't had parts for like 3 marks or 4 marks. All the parts were worth between, I think, 8 marks and 11 marks. So you could roughly say very roughly, you could say that you had about 20 minutes to complete each part. A little bit more for the 11 mark parts, a little bit less for the 8 mark parts, but roughly, if you said 20 minutes for each part, and then that gives you sort of 5 minutes to play with at the end. And it's important that you stick to that, and I'll say more about that presently. So there were 5 clearly identifiable topics, and again, there will usually be on the case study, there will usually be clearly identifiable topics. And the identifiable topics here were audit rotation, control issues and risk within the client, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute, business risks, going concern, and quality control. Now, obviously the issues examined will be different each time, but you're very likely to find that there's some reference somewhere along the way, for example, to risk, to either business risk or audit risk, and you should certainly know how to answer a question on business risk, and you should also know how to answer a question on audit risk, albeit it wasn't asked there. Going concern is very likely to come up on any paper. It's a very big issue for auditors, unfortunately, in the current climate, so that's always very likely to come up. The issue of audit rotation was one of those sort of topical issues that came up, and again, you can expect some issue that's sort of topical to come up. You can also expect there to be some reference to the whole area of controls within the client. Wasn't in this case, but maybe tests of controls and so on. And also asked there was the issue of quality control, practice management. So these were, these aren't going to be obviously the same necessarily, or the same combination on other papers, but very much the case that these were the kind of things that you would expect. The other thing to note was what you were asked to do, is to note the verbs that are used in the examination. Now, the verbs that were used here were evaluate. So twice you were asked, in 2 different instructions, you were asked to evaluate. Okay, and evaluate really means weigh up or suggest, or it's sort of like give the arguments for and against, decide, assess, appraise, discuss. And those are the kind of verbs that you will find at this level. At this level of a paper, you will not, you're not likely to be asked, for example, to list or to describe. You're more likely to be asked to evaluate, to assess, to appraise, to discuss. Those kind of words. So be prepared for that and have an idea of what those words mean when you go into the examination. And this was one area where there was, I think it would be fair to say, some room for improvement. A lot of candidates, for example in Part A, you were asked to critically evaluate the professional guidance on audit rotation. Now, critically evaluating something is a bit more than just saying what the rules are. It's a bit more to it than that. It's not just about saying what the rules are, although obviously in order to evaluate it you have to know what the rules are in the first place. But you really have to be able to say what you think of the rules. Do you think the rules are adequate or not? So it means that you have to say what the rules are, and if you believe they are appropriate. So the kind of things you might have mentioned would be, you could have said, for example, that IFAC, the International Federation of Accountants, is reluctant to make provisions more stringent because powerful accounting firms might lose out if they did. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that that's true, but I'm saying that it is a point that you sometimes see made when people ask the question about how appropriate these rules are. You might have made a couple of other points. For example, you might have said there's no clear consensus when it comes to audit rotation on what the best thing to do is. So it's not as if, when we're talking about audit rotation, it's not as if anyone really knows for certain what we're talking about, in terms of knowing for certain what the best thing to do is. There are advantages and disadvantages in whatever rules you set up. And you might also have said, for example, that partner rotation is promulgated or is suggested as an alternative to audit firm rotation. Now, again, whether it's better or worse, whether it's a sort of compromise, that's for you to decide. What I want you to know is that there is a debate about this. And please don't feel that that this is an exercise in trying to second guess my opinion. I mean, I have opinions on all these matters. I can tell you, and I have maybe some quite strongly held opinions, but I'm not imposing those. I'm not trying to impose those on the candidates. So long as you as a candidate can make a reasonable argument, you will score marks even if I happen not to agree with you. I think that some candidates lack the confidence to give their own opinion. And that sometimes comes through on the papers. Candidates are happy to write down what they know to be right, what they can defend, what they can say, this is in whatever, paragraph 15b of the International Accounting Standards, so I can say it and I can defend it. I can't defend an opinion quite so strongly. But at this level, the fact that the fact that you're aware of what the debate is about is what I want to see. I'm not particularly interested in whether your opinion is in accordance with mine, or how much sense I think it's making. It's, are you aware of the debate that's going on? Are you aware of the points that are being made in the debate that's going on? Can you be critical about, well, in this case it's about the rules in relation to audit partner rotation, but it could be, it could just as easily be the rules or lack of rules about joint audits or small company audits, or any other one of a myriad of controversies that you could think of. And I suppose it's that attempt to get to that level that, if you like, distinguishes these finals papers from the earlier papers. You are very possibly, when you're sitting this paper, it is quite possible that at the start of this paper you're 3.5 hours away from being a fully qualified accountant. And even if you've one or two other subjects to do, you're not more than, you're at the final level. You should be aware of these things. Now, just going through the second part of the question. The second part of the question was about the effect on the company of the fact that they're not allowed access to the, if you like, the internal controls or the internal workings of the service organization, which is this entity in Central America which does the putting of the papers into tablet friendly or e-reader friendly form for them. Now, I actually, when I was setting the question, I intended the question to be about the implications for the company itself. Now, a lot of candidates actually read the question or answered the question as though it were the implications for the external auditor. And I suppose, given that this is an external audit exam, that wasn't an unreasonable way of looking at it. So ultimately, I accepted either of two approaches. So the first approach, which was the approach that I had that was actually in my own head when I was setting the question, was to discuss the risks to the Irish View itself. For example, how could the management be certain that the correct remittances were received each month? How could they be certain of anything, actually? because all they get is a remittance advice from this company telling them that 14,000 issues were sold on a particular day, and here's the countries they were sold in. But actually, if you think about it, they've no verification of that at all. So what are the implications of that for the company was one thing. The other approach that a lot of candidates brought up, and I ultimately allowed it and gave credit for it, was to discuss ISA 402, which is the ISA on service organisations. So candidates who did that were looking at the question from the point of view of the external auditor. Now, it's kind of the same question, because again, the external auditor has to ask the question, well, how do I know those are the correct sales for the company? So it kind of comes back to the same point. And of course, ultimately, the answer is that there is really very little in this case that the company can do, other than, for example, getting hold of and reading the internal audit reports of the service organisation, and looking maybe at doing maybe some substantive analytical procedures or something like that to try and verify the figures. But the fact that the company will not allow them access to their internal control system is, whatever way you look at it, is a gap in the controls, and it is something that the company and the management do need to be concerned about. Or sorry, the auditor and the management of the company need to be concerned about. Part C of the question was, I suppose, a more standard type thing. It requested the candidates to appraise the business risks and what I refer to in the question as the related risks of material misstatement, or sometimes called the financial statement risks in the financial statements. Now, this is a fairly standard type of question. It's basically saying, what risk does the company face, and how might the financial statements be wrong, or how would the financial statements be susceptible to error on account of that risk? So in other words, what could go wrong in the business of the Irish View, and how could that cause the financial statements to be wrong? So, to take a typical example, a business in financial distress is more likely to suppress the existence of liabilities. For example, in the case of the Irish View, one obvious financial statement risk arising from, for example, the expense accounts that the journalists have, is that some elements of expenditure, some elements that are classified as expenditure, should really be classified as journalist remuneration, or journalist salaries, or salaries and benefits in kind, or whatever, to journalists, rather than actually direct expenses of the Irish View. So that's the kind of thing we're looking at. We're kind of saying, what risk does this company face, and as a consequence of those risks, how's that likely to affect the financial statements? Now, the good thing about this sort of question is that the answer really has to be in the question. You really have to be given enough information in the question to answer the question, because you're obviously not going to know before the before the question starts. You're not going to know what you're not going to know before you go into the exam what kind of business is going to come up, and you're obviously therefore not going to be expected to know the risks that could adhere to every type of business that you could think of. I mean, clearly that would be just silly. So you have to be given the information in the question, and that's probably a good thing from a candidate's point of view. Another final point just to be made about this is that it doesn't there doesn't necessarily have to be a specific financial statement risk or a specific risk of material misstatement for every single financial statement risk. For example, if the financial statement risk is a decline in market share or increased competition, there's not necessarily a specific financial statement risk that goes along with that. And if that is the case, you can just say that. Now, you can take a tabular approach. A tabular approach can be useful, but it's probably worthwhile to put in an overall comment at the end appraising the situation, because again, a tabular approach will get you most of the points and will probably get you most of the marks, but it might not be enough to constitute an appraisal. So you need to think about appraising the situation. Now, part D of the question asked or talked about going concern. Now, in my experience as the examiner, questions about going concern are not generally very well answered in the exam. The real question here was asking candidates if the promise by XYZ, who took over as the owner in the year ended June 2013, to keep the entity operating was sufficient to render a going concern qualification unnecessary in 2013. Now, I mean, we probably don't have enough information in the question to really definitively answer that question, even if you accept that a definitive answer to that sort of question is ever really possible. So, what you can say there, the question really here was, I mean, the answer here really was, you would have to check to see a couple of things. One is, was XYZ in a position to make the claim? Was he himself? Now the question says that he's a billionaire, which, you know, if it's actually right, presumably means that he was, but you know, that those sort of terms are thrown around fairly loosely. So was he in a position to make the claim? And the other question would be, does the claim have any sort of legal status? Because if it doesn't have any sort of legal status, then it's nothing more than a statement of intent. And it may well be that if push came to shove, XYZ would not be as good as his word. And if you thought there was a reasonable possibility of that happening, then a going concern qualification should have been included in 2013. That's the kind of discussion that I was looking for from the candidates, and it wasn't particularly well answered. And you know, the conclusion with any of these, the conclusion is less important than the discussion. Now the same could also be said of Part E. The main point, I suppose, to be made in Part E is that there's no specific prohibition on Frank Farlow doing the quality control review. And in any of these sort of, I'm going to say slightly ethical questions, well, questions that slightly turn or touch on the area of ethics, that will be the case. There will often, you know, there will usually be no specific prohibition on it, because frankly, at this level the answer is too easy if there's a specific prohibition. Because if there's a specific prohibition somewhere in the ethical guidelines or whatever, then there's a specific prohibition and that's the end of it. You can't do it. And you know, in an exam, that is the way you have to answer it. If you think there's a specific prohibition, then you have to answer it that way, and you have to say it's prohibited. Now, it's far more likely that there won't be a specific prohibition. It's far more likely that you will have this sort of grey area, where, you know, perhaps the most technically qualified person to do something may not be the best person for other reasons. So in this case, the reason why Frank might not be the best person to do it, or to be seen to have done it, is that he, I think you're told via family trust, owns shares in a rival newspaper group. Now, you might argue, that doesn't matter. It's not this group, and it's 1.5% of the shares or something, so it's an immaterial holding from the point of view of the group anyway. So you could certainly argue that he is the best person to do it. He's the most technically qualified, and we want people who have the technical expertise, and therefore he should be allowed to do it. You could argue the other way, that if he did it, there would somehow be a potential perception of lack of independence, and the perception of independence is so important that that he just shouldn't do it. Again, it's a fairly, in my opinion, it's a fairly 50-50 argument. I'm not asking you to answer the argument. I'm asking you to discuss it, to make the argument. So I would say to you that if you're still unclear about any of the above, have a look back at the examiner's answers and have a look back at the marking scheme. But do remember that the examiner's answers are not necessarily the only correct answers, and in fact, in auditing, as you're probably aware by now, very few answers are actually definitively, well, either correct or incorrect. And a reasonable spread of answers were evident from the scripts that I corrected, and I hope I gave everybody a fair shot in terms of different answers that people may have come up with. I certainly endeavoured to do that. So we're coming to the end of this webinar, but just a few reminders for those of you setting out in a few weeks' time to do the exams. Just a couple of things that I think are perhaps worth looking at. Few basic points. If at all possible, attempt the requisite number of questions and no more. So attempt question 1 and then 2 of questions 2, 3 or 4. It's not generally a good idea to attempt an extra question, even if you have the time to do so. You're better off to go back over the questions you've already attempted. There isn't enough time in the exam to make a good attempt at 3 questions apart from the case study, so don't attempt to do it. As far as possible, attempt each part of each question. It's much easier to get like 1 mark out of 6 for a part of a question where you might otherwise have 0, than to get from 5 marks out of 6 on a part of a question to 6 marks out of 6 on a part of a question. So, if you can at all, make an attempt at every part of every question, because there just might be enough there to enable me to give you a mark. It might be only 1 mark out of 6 or 1 mark out of 8 or something, but it might make all the difference. And if you've written something down, you're giving me an excuse to give you a mark. However, I can't give you a mark for a blank page, so just remember that. The order you do the questions in, I don't think matters, but please can I ask you to take care to number the questions correctly and fill in the front sheet of your answer book. Also, if you answer a question or part of a question out of sequence, please cross-reference it to the main question. So just if you do something out of sequence, just write a note on the main question. I'm always asked this about which question should you attempt first. I would say attempt your best question first. The only caveat I would bring to bear on that is be careful about time. Because if you know something really, really well, you may be tempted to spend too much time on it, and you don't want a situation where you've done, a 25 mark question and you've done it really well, let's say, but you've spent like more than an hour on it. Because at the end of the day, I can only give you 25 marks for it. and it's very rare to get full marks for a question, so in practice you're probably talking about 21, 22 marks, and if you wasted too much time on the question, that could be bad. But nevertheless, I would say attempt your best question first. If you're asked for a report format or something similar, then do the report format, but otherwise don't. It's just a waste of time. So if you're asked to put something in a report format, by all means do it, but don't do it otherwise. And finally, I'd like to wish each and every one of you the very best of luck. I look forward to receiving your papers at the end of August, and I hope you'll all be very successful. Thank you very much.